Let's lighten up.
All right. Good evening, everyone. We are delighted tonight to have Dr. Daryl Burrell. Um, Dr. Burrell is a good friend. I mean, I consider this man like a big brother. Uh, he's my older brother. Let me switch over to presentation mode. Let me move things around here real quick. All right. So Dr. Daryl Burrell is a postgraduate student and a 2017 graduate of the National Coalition Building Institute of Leadership Diversity Institute. He is a certified diversity professional. He is a graduate of the International Coaching Federation approved executive coaching program. He is an alumnus of the prestigious U.S. Governmental Presidential Fellows Program. And we're going to talk about the Presidential Fellows Program after the presentation also.
Yeah, you don't have to read all that. We don't.
You don't want me to? Man, we gotta give you the prestigious of this. We gotta
Well,
we
to
gotta
me,
roll out the red carpet for you, man.
right, the reason why I try to explain, you know, the bio and I try to tell a little bit about my story is I tell that to tell people that, a lot of times we navigate our world with these timelines and maybe they're not realistic. Or we navigate our world based on other people's timelines or perspectives. What I tell people is, I'm someone that got my bachelor's degree when I was 30, and I've been a lifelong learner ever since. And a lot of times people always tell us, well, by 25, I need to be this. By 30, I need to be that. Or I'm too old to do that. Or I shouldn't do this. And I just believe that, life is an evolutionary process. And as people live longer and get older, there are different things that will and fit you. And I think if anything with COVID and things going on, it really should inspire all of us to pursue our passions and our interests. Because life is not promised, life is not guaranteed. One of the things that's going to be different from me is I'm not conventional. My career path was not linear. Some of you all that are interested in that, and maybe you chose a graduate program that was different, there's some things that I might say to you that might resonate for you. One of the things I think a lot of times is if we choose a different path, we have to navigate that world of imposter syndrome. Do I belong? Am I worthy? Or navigate that world of, because people might not know my school, do I have to defend it? Right? Or do I have to explain it? You know, and, we live in a society where everyone's used to these very names, and there's some assumption sometimes that people think, oh, because I didn't go to Stanford or Duke or Georgetown, then maybe I can't do good government policy or I can't make an impact. And I'm an example to all of you that thinking is wrong. And I'm an example to explain to you that we live in a knowledge economy now where you're going to market yourself, and what you do and how you do it is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Um, the days of, oh, I got this master's degree from this school and it's automatic, don't exist. People are going to hire you, promote you, give you opportunities based on your ability to solve their problems. And that's why I tell people, when you're in a program like an MPA or an MBA, one of the things you want to do is really start to figure out what your niche is and what you really love, and then realize that your next level is going to be self-directed. So if you course of that content that you love, your next level is going to be, how can I become an expert on that? How can I learn what I need to learn on that? Because I tell people, your knowledge and expertise in this day and age is your only job security. Organizations that laid tons of people off, the people didn't get laid off were not just essential workers, they had knowledge and expertise that no one besides them. And so, and I also tell people that the value of a master's degree is kind of diminished. There was an article that came out in the Washington Post in 2014 where they said from 2000 to 2014, the awards of master's degrees in the United States have gone up 63%. So you have some schools like Georgetown and George Washington now, they award close to 4,000 master's degrees a year. They're awarding more master's degrees than undergraduate degrees. I try to explain to people is a master's degree now is becoming what a bachelor's degree was 30 years ago. And so one of the things you need to think about is, okay, I'm not just getting this degree. What do I want to do with it? How do I want to leverage it? How does it fit in my grand scheme of things? And as you progress through your program, as you think about those things, you want to start to highlight those things in your cover letter and let those things become your elevator speech. You know, I always tell people all along, if you know you want to do something significant in policy, one of the things you should start thinking about now is if that person who was the CEO or the executive director of that organization met you in the elevator and you were going up to the 17th floor, how could you introduce yourself and engage them in a manner to let them recognize and see that, hey, you're someone that can be in that organization? And if you haven't had that discussion with yourself or you haven't crafted that out, you should. I've met people on planes, I've met people in bars that I never knew when I sat down next to them, they could be as influential as they are, but these things come to play. And so as we kind of navigate through these discussions, it's pretty informal. I'll share kind of my government experience with you. Some different things when I worked at government agencies, things related to collaborations between government and the community, and really some things that you should think about in terms of career and other aspects. So Ahmad, you can take it to the next slide, Dr. Rahim, please. So we'll talk about some real world perspectives in government. I gave you a little bit of my background, but I'll share a little bit with you. I finished my bachelor's degree and immediately 3 weeks later started my master's. But my story was I flunked out, stopped and started my undergraduate degree 3 or 4 times before and when I finished in a bachelor completion program. And what I learned was that traditional undergraduate programs did not teach to my learning style. I don't learn well by you lecture for hours, and then I try to take notes, and then I go home and scratch my head and think about what are you going to put on the test, and then I repeat back to you. I learn better while you give me a theory and give me an opportunity to apply that theory and solve real world problems. And that's how I learned. And I felt like, and as a professor, I teach in that way. I teach around experiential learning. I don't give tests in my class. I give case studies. I give real life examples that you know how to apply this. And so I finished my first master's degree in 1999. I've been a student in school ever since. Finished my doctorate in 2010. You know, it took me 10 years to finish my doctorate in 3 programs. I met Dr. Rahim in the second of the 3. So I told this to tell people all about perseverance. You know, it's all about your own drive. You know, I commend everyone here for saying, I want to get a graduate degree, but I don't just want to go to some also ran school that everyone else is going to. I want to go to something different. I want to learn in a different way. And I want to make a difference and impact with my degree. And I'll tell people, your education is a passport. It can take you anywhere you want to go. And probably somewhere along the way, Dr. Rahim or myself or any of you all to connect with me afterwards, the discussion as you get to the end is, have you thought about doing a doctorate next? You know, and a lot of people cringe and they frown their face up. And I'm like, you know, if you can do this, and if you love the learning and you love the social change and you love the impact, you know, it should be part of your thought process. Now, some of you are probably thinking, oh, I can just barely get through what I'm doing right now. About that. Well, I think, you know, I was that person too. Dr. Rahim was that person too. And you can see the plaques behind his wall. Mine aren't up, but you can see how you evolve and you build confidence and you kind of build your way in your journey and your vision. You know, one of the things that I think is critical as you approach this program to start to think about what do you want to do when you get out and strategically plan that path. And we'll talk about that. The other thing we'll talk about is some innovative examples in government and what's going on. You know, I'll share my experience with you in a government agency and I'll talk about some innovative things that my agency did, as well as some others. And then I'll answer questions that you may want to have moving forward. Next slide, Dr. Rahim. So there's a lot of organizations out there that are non-governmental that you guys should be aware of, that are doing a lot of policy related work, white papers, research around government. If you're not aware of them, you should be. The first of which is a Partnership for Public Service. They do a lot of work in white papers around the federal government. The second one is the National Academy of Public Administration. They actually function as an organization that brings, experts in, and they actually do policy work, consulting work to government organizations. Brookings Institute is a very prominent think tank in Washington. I put one twice. Association of Public Policy Analysis and Management and American Society of Public Administration. The professional American Society of Public Administration is one you should be in. The other one, Public Policy Analysis, is another one. I always tell people, join these associations as a student, because the membership might be 10% of what regular people pay to be part of these organizations. The other thing that's real important is, if you're a lot of these organizations have annual conferences, and I tell people, as a member, you can volunteer as a student volunteer, and they can waive the fee for you to attend or go to the conference. And Dr. Rahim, I'm sure, will share my slides with you, afterwards. Next slide, Dr. So let's talk about the work of government. So, part of government is regulation, part of government is serving the community, and part of government is public safety. So when you start to think about regulation, one thing could be like the agency I work with, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so what we did was, when I would always share that, people would say, "Oh, you do nuclear weapons?" No, we don't do anything with nuclear weapons. All we did was regulate the commercial use of nuclear power in the United States. And we also regulated any university that had a nuclear engineering program, as well as any hospitals that had a nuclear medicine program. Other things, when you talk about organizations that serve the community, maybe Department of Health and Human Services, right? And CDC, they're taking a leadership role now around COVID and how we vaccinate people, get information out there. And then the next one is public safety. It may be a larger scale, Department of Defense, could be National Guard, could be your local police. Next slide. So I worked for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for 8 years. I came to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as a Presidential Management Fellow. If you're not familiar with that, I tell people, anyone that's doing a master's degree, it's something you should consider. The website, www.pmf.gov. The Presidential Management Fellow was originally called the Presidential Management Internship Program, and it was created by an executive order by Jimmy Carter when he was president in 1977. Jimmy Carter created this program because he was concerned that people with advanced degrees, law degrees, would not seek government as a professional career. He was worried about a brain drain, that the brightest and the best of us in this country would not seek government service in terms of what we did. He was also concerned that the promotion track for government to better salaries and better opportunities was very slow compared to private industry. So what he did was he created a 2-year fast track program to take people with advanced degrees to leadership roles in the federal government. And so for me, I applied, and there's a rigorous process when you apply, and they usually open in the fall. So if you're interested in government career as you get through, you want to go to their website and get on a listserv. And they usually open the job announcement anywhere but in either September or October. It's open for 3 weeks. You apply, and then once you apply, you go through a whole series of assessments. The first thing they do is they look at your resume and then they send you an online assessment. Oh, it's called the Presidential Management Fellows Program, www.pmf.gov. And so you apply, and essentially the way the fellowship works is they can bring you in as low as a GS9 salary or as high as a GS12. So in DC, probably a GS9 salary is probably in the neighborhood of $80,000 a year. GS12 salary is 100. If you come in less than a GS12, you come in at a 9, next year you get promoted to 11, next year you get promoted to a GS12, and then you can outplace as a 12 or 13. And the salaries have gone up since I've been there. Now, when I got in, the majority of the jobs were in Washington, D.C. Now they have jobs in the country. So you could be a PMF and essentially work anywhere. And really, a lot of the major agencies participate: State Department, Department of Energy, Forest Service, Department of Interior.
Looks like we might have lost Dr. Burrell, but the program actually allows you to rotate. So you're not stuck in one agency. You get a full salary when you get into the program. There's no age requirement. You just need a master's, right? You don't need a master's in a certain category. You can have an MBA, you can have an MPA, you can have a Master of Arts. But when you apply, they want to know exactly why you want to work for government, right? So you put together a personal essay, what they call a CV. Basically, it's your resume, but in more detail, right? They want letters of references, and for you to highlight some of the projects you're working on. So for some of you, it might be the community work that you're engaged in, right? It might be the organization, the projects that you're working on, or it could be your capstone project that you want to take this capstone project that you're working with at the studio, and you want to apply it in the context of government and policy, right? So it could be any of those things. Dr. Burrell would tell you that when he applied, it was very limited to women. I mean, like there was very little women that were applying, and people of color, right? So take a look at it. Everybody that I know that completed this program are doing very well. They either stayed in government or they moved on to do something else. They became consultants, worked for lobbying groups, or they became a professor and so forth. Dr. Burrell mentioned to you that
what is the name of the fellowship?
it's the Presidential Management Fellows, right? You can take a look, just Google it. It's the only one that's out there, right? And you can, and they actually, hold on, I think that's him. Let me see. Nope, not yet. They actually appreciate people that pursued non-traditional education. Let's see, he's logging. Okay, let me see. Yeah, they're looking for people that provide different perspectives when it comes to dealing with problems, when it comes to solutions, right? Often those people that get into certain government agencies often are coming from the same background, right? So there's a groupthink that's happening. We know that's happening in the federal government, that everyone's kind of thinking the same way and doing things the same way based on where they came from, what school they went to, right? That, when you look at certain departments within the federal government, there was a lot of Georgetown graduates, right? There were a lot of Harvard graduates, Kennedy School, right? And this program is doing a pretty good job. Hopefully it expands. It shrunk during Trump's administration, but hopefully Biden expands it to open it to more people and create a better pipeline. And as he mentioned earlier, that it used to be just for people that want to work in DC. But since then, different branches of the government, are located in different states. So you don't have to worry about just being stuck in DC, right? You can pursue it go through the process, go through their rotation, so you actually can get a feel of which agency you want to work for, right? So you actually get a paid rotation. You can work for the CIA, you can work for the FBI, you can work for the you can work for different Congress representative, different Senate representatives. You can work on the lobbying side. You can work on the administrative side. You can work on the campaign side, right? And after 2 years of this rotation, they will actually bid. So they actually compete to get you to take on the role in their department, right? So it's kind of a cool opportunity. All right, so Dr. Burrell is back. Dr. Burrell, you with us? I thought I just saw him. All right.
Sorry, everyone.
All right, no problem.
My power went out for a minute and flickered back on.
I'm telling you, man, it's that 1 inch of snow. That's all it takes down there.
I've been having that problem. My internet, it's like the wind blows and it blows the internet away.
So, sorry. So just to tell you a little bit about the Presidential Management Fellows is, on a given year, there are some 80 agencies will participate. There's some agencies like Department of Housing and Urban Development will use it as their succession planning. They'll hire 100 fellows a year and they'll fast track you. So in order to apply, your graduate degree can't be, you need to be getting your graduate degree in the next year, or your graduate degree can't be any more than 2 years old, right? Or if you were ex-military, it can be up to 6 years old. So anytime you get in a 12-month window, you can apply for the fellowship program. I will tell people that it was one of the experiences I had. And as I said, the process is rigorous. They send you a scenario-based multiple choice thing that they do online. That's 150 questions, and they're more to think. Are you ethical? What are your values? How you focus on teamwork, leadership, public service? They're all around that. And there'll be multiple choice questions where there's 4 answers, and one is more right than the other. So it's unproctored. You take that, and then when you get to the end, they give you a scenario where you have to write about something about yourself to see your real quick. And I'll tell you, copy and paste does not work. And so if you get through that, then they invite you into a 1-day assessment. And they have these locations around the country where you'll come in for the day. They usually invite, 15 people at a time, and they'll give you scenarios. And there's really a couple of phases. The first phase is that you get interviewed, and assessors will ask you questions about teamwork, your public service motivation, and your leadership. And really, it's part of the discussion that I had with you earlier about what's your why. Why are you interested in this? Why do you want to do it? Why are you choosing to pursue this career over another? What's your public service motivation? Mine always was, my parents had both retired from the federal government. And for me, I was profoundly impacted by 9/11. I worked for a university that actually held classes on the Pentagon. And that day that 9/11 occurred, we actually were worried because we could not get in touch with our employees and faculty. We ended up, a student passed away that day. And so after that, I really became really interested in serving the country. I was not a military person, but I felt like I could serve the government or the country through government service. And so I pursued that. But the assessors will ask you your public service motivation, how you work in a team, those things. And then they'll give you one scenario where it's a situation and you have to write an email response about how you would deal with it. And then they'll give you, and you read the scenario, and then you have 30 minutes to come up with an email response. And they'll give you another scenario, and you have to do a 5-minute presentation as to what your response would be. And then the third scenario is they'll put you in a group. In that scenario where you did the 5-minute presentation, you will have to do in a group, and it's more, they call it like a fishbowl exercise. And if you're not familiar with a fishbowl exercise, you engage in a discussion and activity, and people observe you when they write about the things they observe. And that exercise essentially is really trying to measure, can you lead, can you follow, can you play sandbox with others? And if they see that, then essentially you can become a finalist, and they invite you to the job fair, which is in DC, or they tell you who the people are that are hiring contacts at any of the agencies, and you go. The job fair is 3 days in DC, and there's usually 80 agencies there. They have, and then they go back in the private and you interview. Now, the year I applied, there were, they said on an annual year, they'll get anywhere from 7,000 to 9,000 applicants. They tend to select 10%. So if it's 9,000, they'll probably accept 1,000. The year I applied, there was 7,000. There was 350 finalists. Of the 350 finalists, I think 185 of us actually landed jobs. So just because you're a finalist, you still have to find an agency that will hire you. Now, there were some people, their whole mindset is, only want to work at what I call the sexy agencies. So as you see, the line was long for USD, State Department, FBI. Those lines were around the corner, and there were some people that only wanted to interview with those or agencies. I did 27 interviews, and I got 9 job offers, and I used the best one. Nuclear Regulatory Commission was not on my radar. I wanted to work at the National Institutes of Health. My mom was a breast cancer survivor, so they had an Office of Women's Health and an Office of Minorities Health, and I really was interested in that. But you start to find that some agencies have a lot of money, some don't. And that agency was one that they just didn't have a lot of money. Interesting enough, some of the agencies that were well funded, the offers they made were very generous and lucrative, were Department of Veteran Affairs and Social Security Administration. Department of Veteran Affairs, not only were they willing to bring me in at the highest grade, but they were willing to pay back up to $60,000 in student loans. These programs will pay back $60,000, $10,000 a year for 6 years. You have to stay 3 years for each year they pay. So if they pay for 1, you got to stay 3. If they pay for $60,000 to get to $60,000, you got to stay 9 years. Is really how it works. The Social Security Administration was interesting in that they had a huge not succession planning problem. Apparently, 75% of their highest graded employees, the highest level managers in there, retired immediately. And they had no succession plan. So imagine an organization where 75% of the managers could walk out the door. What would your organization function like? And so they knew that they had to bring new people in, bring young people in, attract young people in government, and so they're participating. My agency was not on the radar, but they recruited me, and it was interesting when I got there. I was like, I'm not a nuclear engineer. I thought I had to be a nuclear engineer. But they had a support office that was great, and they have offices that support everything they do. So they had HR, they have leadership, they had everyone else. And so I was like, okay, I'll go in there. My background was more business, organizational development, OD, those types of. And in that agency, I was a stepchild and a fish out of water because they had a hierarchy in that agency. Nuclear engineer was top, electrical engineer was next, chemical engineer. At the bottom was civil engineer. Then they had the scientists, a lot of the ologists, biologists, geologists, those. So if you were not a scientist and an engineer, you were a second-class citizen in that organization. Someone asked a question about diversity and inclusion. So, and how did that come up? There was not a lot of conversation about that. I would just tell you that my agency was not very, very diverse when I went there. And you'll find a lot of government agencies, and mine was very male dominated. We had a lot of issues with women of color, and we had a lot of issues with people of color and women in general in our organization, because we're considered a STEM. U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Agency, a similar peer organization is National Science Foundation or NASA. They were like our peer organization. And so one of the cool things as you speak about diversity was one of the projects I worked on as a fellow is how we got more women and people of color in our agency and what strategies could we use to get more women and people of color in our agency. And so one of the things I immediately did was, started to identify some of the very strong minority serving institutions, historically Black colleges and traditional women's colleges that were around the country. And these colleges that had science and engineering programs, most of them tended, especially the women's college, tend to have more like biology majors, chemistry majors, geology majors versus engineering, because engineering is a real expensive program to deliver, but we still develop partnerships. And I try to identify people within the organization that had graduated from those types of institutions. And we created a champion program where those people actually came on recruiting visits with us, and we did relationships with us. The other thing I worked to do to kind of foster that relationship is we had a program that was on the books that a lot of people weren't taking advantage of, was a faculty exchange program where we would allow faculty to come to the NRC and we would pay their salary while they were there and to the university, and they would work on projects as a way to immerse themselves with what was happening in government and be able to take that back to their classroom or engage in research. Our agency as a regulatory agency was very, very unique in that we oversaw the commercial use of nuclear power, but a lot of what we did was research around nuclear power issues, and our various office came out with white papers, projects, guidance that went to the commissioners that were over our agency, which we had 5 commissioners, and there were rules of the 5 commissioners, no more than 3 could be Democrat or Republican. They're appointed by the president, and then they would act on our guidance based on a culmination of research that the various offices would put together on a nuclear power issue or a nuclear power related issue. So one of the coolest jobs I did there was we had a problem because we would hire people because they were great scientists and engineers, but then when they had to manage people, they had problems because they had never taken management and leadership course. So a lot of the work I did was create leadership development programs to teach technical people leadership skills, people skills, soft skills to navigate in that realm. And then the other cool project I worked on early on was knowledge management. Knowledge management is becoming a huge issue in government. Those of you all that don't know what it is, knowledge management is in any organization, there's critical knowledge that sits in that organization. A lot of times it sits in the expertise of the organization. So if Dr. Rahim was to quit, we could replace someone, but there's a lot of knowledge that Dr. Rahim has that ain't written down nowhere. And what tends to happen in the federal government is that people retire, and that's the reason why they bring people back with crazy taxpayers' money as a contractor after they've retired from their government job, where they're able to double dip and get their government retirement, but then make this additional salary along with it. And so one of my projects I did was to help stand up our first knowledge management initiative. And how this got spurred was congressmen and senators that was oversight of our agency showed up one day and said, you know what if terrorists crashed an airplane into a nuclear power plant? What would we do? right? Well, the crazy part was 3 years before 9/11 actually occurred, we had a that dealt with kind of research and development that had already done a project on that. And it already created guidance and safety protocols for our nuclear plant licensees on how to deal with that. But here's the problem. The guy who did the research had retired, and no one knew where the research was. So someone who had his cell phone number called him in Florida, and he said, "Oh, it's in this file cabinet on the third floor." So someone opened a dusty file cabinet that hadn't been opened in 3 years, and there was the research in there, right? So we realized that we have a better place in order to track this research and to track this knowledge, and we need to have mechanisms in place. And as a result, we decided that we needed to hire a chief knowledge management officer. And each person had to have a knowledge management person who had ownership in that various office and division that would deal with knowledge management. And the first thing that happened was the IT people came in and said, well, let's just put everything in a database. So what we started to do was just to put all our documents in a database, but not thinking it through. The database was not set up with a searchable feature like Google. So then we had a database with 1 million documents in it and no way to search it. And so we realized that we really had to think a little bit and a lot differently about how we did these things, and we had to be more strategic and more intentional. And so as you start to think about government work, people with strategic project management skills are in a premium in government because, you know, as these things come up and arise, these are the people that will document the projects, execute the projects, and make sure that we have everything in line. And so one of the things I did in my project in HR was I started a great lecture series. So anyone that was retiring that had been there more than 10 years, we brought them in the auditorium and they shared questions and lessons learned about their job for 2 hours, and we recorded it and we kept it on a SharePoint drive. And that way people that came in after that person could watch and see those things. The other thing we got approved was double encumbering. So double encumbering means if Dr. Rahim is retiring and we know he's giving us a year notice, 6 months before he retires, we have authorization to hire that can shadow him for the last 3 to 6 months that he's there to learn his job. And then the final project we did was everyone else had to process map their job. It first started with a time study, but everyone had a binder that talked about the duties they did on a weekly, daily, monthly basis. So if God forbid Darrell Burrell got hit by a car, that binder was there where someone could pick that up. And so we put those mechanisms in place. And so as an agency, the things that we oversaw, and I mentioned before, is we also issue license for nuclear power plants to operate. And then we also regulate them. We investigate them in terms of safety and security. Next slide, Dr. Rahim. And, you know, number 5 is the one where we really collaborate with industry. And so one of the things that we actually do is there's a job called resident inspector that is a person from our agency that actually their job is they're on site at a nuclear power plant. Their job is to roam around and see what's going on at that nuclear power plant. And so one of the things that made me pick the Nuclear Regulatory Commission over other government agencies was we had a lot of resources and money. And you'll start to find that some government agencies like Forest Service, which I love the environment, but they were broke. You know, when I wanted to doctorate or do professional development, they had no money for me. They didn't actively participate in the student loan repayment program. Whereas Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NASA, Department of Veteran Affairs, these organizations had a Part of the reason why we had so much money was we only had to get 15 to 10% of our operating budget from Congress. Self-generated the majority of our money through fines and operating licenses that we gave to nuclear power plants. So as a result, we were in a unique fashion that we had what was called no year money. So most government agencies have to spend their money by the end of September, September 31st, or they lose that money, goes back to the government. But by having no year money, we could roll that money over to the next year. And we could utilize that in the next year. And so when I came there at a fascinating time. I came there at a time when we were supposed to get our first nuclear power plants for the first time in almost 30 years. And part of the reason why that came to play was that in 2003, remember in the Northeast, the power grid went out. And what we started to realize was we really needed to develop our energy independence. Remember during George Bush's presidency, gas went to $5 a gallon. So there was a lot of emphasis in how we develop nuclear power as an alternative fuel source to move away from fossil fuels. But part of the problem with that is, even though it's clean energy, there's a lot of danger to it. The United States has some very strict rules that other countries that engage in nuclear don't. One of which is it's illegal to reprocess the spent fuel. So some of our other countries, when the nuclear fuel is spent, you can reprocess it and 80% of the waste by reusing the fuel. We don't have that. So what tends to happen is we have these spent nuclear fuel that's all over the place, and sometimes it's on site at the nuclear power plant, because one of the other options out there was Department of Energy was supposed to create a nuclear repository in Nevada to be able to store the nuclear power plant. And you know, with politics and administration, we spent dollars of government money safeguarding it and investigating it, only for that plant, that facility to be sitting there unused. So right now with nuclear power plants, a spent fuel is usually on site at the nuclear facility in some kind of holding tank or some kind of environment to protect it. So we had some cool offices there. The Office of Research, which you had a lot of engineers where they used to do fun experiments, like take a tractor trailer and drive it 60 miles an hour with a canister that you put nuclear fuel and crash it into a wall and see if it will bust open to expose the nuclear stuff. We had another group that would take the canister that you teach the nuclear fuel and cover it with jet fuel and light it on fire and see what would happen with it. And so all of these, from a regulatory standpoint, was we would engage in research, and a lot of that research was to inform us on guidance and policy, right, to help make decisions on how we were going to regulate the nuclear power industry. Next slide. So one of the things that happened is, you know, the economy and Murphy's Law and the dynamics tend to change. So when I got there in the agency, historically, Nuclear Regulatory Agency was very, very small, 3,100 people. But what was happening was we thought we were going to get as many as 30 applications for new power plants. And remember, at that time, there was the election. Obama was running against McCain, and there was a lot of conversation about that. So what happened, a lot of these businesses lined up and put their applications together to get nuclear power plants, and there was going to be government funding. But if you can go back to history, some dynamics that happened that changed that, meaning that the banks collapsed, subprime mortgage and automobile industry collapsed. So what was going to be intended to fund nuclear power plants went to bailout organizations. So what happened was, originally, we only got 12 applications that were up front. Only 3 of the 12 got government funding. And what happened was a lot of the organizations were in a holding pattern saying, I'm not going to make $1 billion capital investment that might be an overrun, right? That'll take me forever to recoup that. So one of the things you need to know in this country, that a lot of the power plants you have are plants that were built in the 60s and 70s that exist. So as we started to get these applications for new power plants we were processing, we realized that we had a knowledge management problem in our agency, meaning a 0.5% of the engineers that were there the last time we had an application for new power plants still work there. And we had these new engineers and we had to train them and get them up to speed. And one of the challenges we had was power plant design had changed. The #1 maker of power plants was Mitsubishi. We know Mitsubishi for cars, but they're an organization that they have the plans and blueprints, and they have a real huge market share in power plants. And the place where they're building the majority of power plants are in Japan. So one of the things we had to do as an agency was we had to send 14 engineers to Japan to see these power plants in operation and to also see these power plants being built, because otherwise, how can you regulate the construction of a new power plant if you've never seen the construction phases? Part of things we did in terms of government was we went to Congress and we a $15 million grant to create workforce infrastructure to support these new plants. Because one of the dynamics that was happening in the industry was when we stopped building nuclear power plants, a lot of universities got rid of their nuclear engineering program because it was too expensive to run for a handful of students. These universities were coming back, so we were grant funding them to develop new programs and new curriculum to develop the next generation of nuclear engineers. And part of that, we earmarked part of that funding to go to minority serving institutions. So one of the institutions that really benefited from that, historically Black colleges, were North Carolina A&T and South Carolina State University. South Carolina State University is the only historically Black college in the country that has a nuclear engineering program. And so through there, we funded curriculum, development, and things related to that our first go around. And in the second year, we got the 15 million. We sent a lot of that money to community colleges, construction management programs, because we needed to develop people that can construct these nuclear power in terms of workforce development. The other things we did was we had grants where we also funded people in rare areas where we needed expertise. We funded their PhD. So things like nuclear criticality, things like that. We had people where we had fellowships, where we had funding, where we would pay to fund you to do a PhD, and in return, you had a service commitment to come work at our agency. Some interesting things that occurred when I was there: the Fukushima earthquake. One of the things that was crazy was we got bombarded by the public and the news as if we were responsible for that. Our agency was not. That was a State Department issue. It was not in the United States. We were only interested in things in the United States. The other thing was on the East Coast in 2011, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware had an earthquake. And so a lot of nuclear power plants in those states shut down. We got a ton of Freedom of Information Act requests around that. And so one of the things that we did as an agency was we had a public affairs office. That office tends to be small. So what we had to do was train people to work on answering phones and a help desk related to that, because when an accident occurs, we were overrun with correspondence and communications. One of the things we did as a contingency plan was we created an emergency response website, which we called the dark website. Most people say dark, confused with that. but it was a website that was not accessible until an emergency occurred, and it had standard content already there. Because there's some things that you automatically know when emergency occurs. We're aware of this emergency. Here's what's going on. We've activated our emergency response team. And then what we did was a series of generic press releases around that where we could plug and play information when an accident occurred. And what we would do when an accident would occur, we would make that website our main government agency website when an issue would occur. And we cross-train people on how to answer questions and do things related to that. Those were some of the cool projects. I got cross-trained on that because emergency response is a real issue. And then the other project I worked on was when a nuclear accident occurs, how do we take lessons learned from Katrina to make sure that we're engaging vulnerable populations or underserved populations when those things occur? So I kind of share those things through the lens of my government career. Is I was able to do some interesting things there, and to kind of tell you, to make you think about your own career, how these things kind of weave through how these agencies function and what they do. Next slide. Next slide. I talked about that. So one of the things our agencies did was, and I'll share a little bit with you all, to tell you how we collaborate externally with the community, was we partner with the community. So we had a lot of task forces that dealt with things related to emergency response planning. A lot of times when a nuclear power plant is being proposed to either be developed in a community or licensed to be renewed, or that plan is designed to be decommissioned, we issue public hearings where we allow the public to come in and voice their concerns. We engage in the public and university through environmental impact studies. And we have a series of public hearings where we allow public comment, and we keep that on the record. One of the things when President Obama was president, where he created his Transparency in Government initiative, where we would have those hearings and they would just occur, and we keep them internally. Now we keep the minutes from those things on our website that can be accessed publicly. And a lot of our regulatory documents and things are out there publicly. As I said, we also have resident inspectors on the site. One of the things we did as an agency was we were concerned that creating more people in the industry. So we created a leadership development program that was similar to the Presidential Management Fellows program that we ran internally. Because what was happening in the agency, in the nuclear power industry, was people were poaching scientists and experts from other companies, and the salaries were going through the roof. And because universities were not producing new graduates, we had to leverage Congress to get funding to fund PhD students and programs. But then we also had to get programs where we were people with engineering backgrounds to consider the nuclear power industry as a career. So we had a 2-year developmental program where we developed them to either work in our agency or become resident inspectors on site at a nuclear power plant. Next slide. So as I shared with you before, the government is going through some workforce development issues. There's a huge brain drain that's happened in the government. A lot of people have not been seeking government as a career. It's been kind of a downward trend. And so there's a lot of issues with recruiting, talent management, knowledge management. And this is where you guys can step in if you want to work in government and really find your place. Next slide. So I'm going to flip a little bit and talk a little bit about some government partnerships that are out there. And, you know, one of the things, for example, Department of Justice and FBI is working on reform. So some of the policy things they're working on is, after Ferguson, policy people created guidance on how we reform police forces. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about local government, what local government's doing, because I've talked a lot with federal government, what local government's doing to collaborate with the community, and I'll use my own city police force. They hired a new police. You knew there was a lot of dynamics with Black Lives Matter out there. So what they did was one of the officers they hired was a community liaison, and that officer was a female of color, and that officer was tasked to go out and engage underserved communities and get their feedback on how the police was conducting themselves and recommendations on how to be more inclusive in their policies. They scheduled a series of town hall meetings, and they were done through the minority serving church, where the police officer had them on Sunday after church, and where there was repast and food, and there was conversations, and that was situations where people of color were allowed to tell their stories about their difficult interactions with police and make recommendations on how those experiences could be different. A lot of police forces are involved. They're creating community task force where they're creating listening posts for the community to make recommendations on how they do things. And then the other things is they're commissioning, collaborating with universities to do research and research studies, to conduct focus groups, collect data, things related to that. So, if you're interested in public administration because you want a difference, I share these kind of experiences with you because these are new emerging practices that are happening out there where you might have a passion where maybe you can leverage your ability and interest. One of the big areas that's coming down the pipe is a lot of these agencies now are more open to diversity and inclusion. So a lot of first diversity and inclusion officers, a lot of them are hiring policy people to help them develop diversity policies within their state, local, and city governments. Next slide. So some other collaborative approaches, I talked about presidential management fellows. The department has a ton of them. They have a Jefferson Science Fellows where they recruit faculty from universities to go there. They have a Franklin Fellows where they select mid-career people to come in there and work on policy issues. And then, there's a lot of congressional fellowships where you can go and work on Capitol Hill with and use your background in public administration and engage in research and do white papers and policy papers that could influence voting or policy development for a congressman and a senator. I know for me, I wanted to work in congressional affairs at my agency because we have a congressional affairs office. So every federal agency has a congressional affairs. And this is the thing where I'll tell you about how the Presidential Management Fellows kind of helped me. So the director of congressional affairs, I kept emailing her, contacting her. She never responded to me. Very blew me off. Till one day I sent her an email and said I was a presidential fellow, right? She immediately contacted me, excuse me.
He has a little puppy back there. He's not gonna talk about it, but he's
So she once I told her that I was a fellow, she said, you could come by right now. I was a fellow 15 years ago. So one of the things you'll start to find is just like people are part of a certain group that will look out at people, if you have the opportunity to be a presidential management fellow, there are a lot of people that will open doors for you that were former fellows. And that's a unique advantage of coming in from kind of a elite and exclusive club. Like the interesting thing was people got hired along with me, and the person that got hired regularly, the boss said, here's your work, go do your work. Where the boss did to me, asked me, Daryl, what do you want to do? And so it's kind of a different approach. And, one of the things that happened at my agency was I was the first presidential manager hired in 10 years. And part of the problem was they hired 3 previously, and they were so demanding and unrealistic that they got nicknamed, because the nickname for Presidential Management Fellow is PMF, but they got nicknamed PMF, but they got nicknamed for Prima Donna Management Fellows. And so so my agency was like, we didn't do it because the last time they were very demanding. They didn't want to work, but they wanted a lot of benefits. They want to get promoted. And so there's all these other dynamics. And one of the ones that, depending on the agency you work for too, that you have to be cautious about is, one of the challenges in government is there are a lot of people at the levels because they've been there a long time. And one of the things you'll bump your heads up against is you might have a boss that has no bachelor's degree, but they've been there 30 years. And sometimes you got to navigate that where you're coming in with an advanced degrees. There's some people that will be jealous to you. People in my agency that said, oh, you're coming in as a GS9. Took me 20 years to get a GS9, and you're coming in as a GS9 in that grade. So there are those dynamics that are out there. Next slide, Dr. Rahim. So the other thing to think about is, if you're doing research and research projects, is how you want to make a name for yourself as a scholar. And so a lot of you all will be in classes where you'll write about papers and do things that you're about. I will tell you, take those things to a next level, publish those papers in peer review venues and journals. There are a lot of journals that will take conceptual backed up by literature. What we have here, I'm showing you, is a research project I did on ethics and policing. And I turned it into a journal article. I presented it at a conference. It's on YouTube, but the organization is a policy studies organization in DC, and they have a criminology conference. It was in 2019. So I did a presentation on policing in certain communities, and I turned it into an academic paper, and I published it as a peer review paper, and then I sent that paper off to local police chiefs. And as an end result, I got a small consulting project to do diversity and inclusion training for. But the cool thing about that is, if I'm going to a congressman or a senator, if I'm going to get hired by a federal agency, it's pretty cool in the interview process where you can show them a peer-reviewed journal article that you published to add credibility. Remember, we live in a knowledge society. 20 years to show your transcripts and grades, and that's all people need. Now people want artifacts that show that you're an expert that you say that you are. And so just to tell you a bit about this project, was I was concerned with ethics and policing. It was something that stirred me. So I started doing research on it around ethics. And then what I wanted to do was collect data. And I went through the largest Black police organization and asked these current and former African-American police officers, think we can reform police to make them more ethical, especially around things in culture and race. And what you're seeing right here is the final recommendations that came down there. And one is create ethical expectations. So a lot of times it's gray, but if you make sure that these are our values, that people are ethically clear, then you build that culture. One is to make ethics part of performance evaluation, where it's not now, where you make it a thing that's measured, and you make it a requirement for promotion. One of the things was they talked about publicly reward ethical behavior. So one of the ideas I recommended when I did this consulting thing was to create an award called People to Watch. And what the People to Watch award was something I created a long time ago, where police forces could get these watches, these very small watches with the logo in it, and allow people in the community, when they found a police officer that did something great or ethical or positive, they could recognize them. And then what would happen is that police officer would be acknowledged and recognized in front of their peer, and they get a watch and they get a diploma. I mean, a certificate that they were recognized as one of the people to watch. And some places they even I recommend to put a cash bonus behind it. The other thing is to create mechanisms in police forces, anonymous ways to report unethical behavior. One of the challenges with reforming police is that thin blue line, that wall of silence where they're like, we need to defend each other. And a lot of times telling on a fellow officer could put you in risk when you need that officer to back you up at some kind of activity. So creating anonymous ways to investigate things were important. The other is to educate people on a regular basis. So when minor offenses occur, give people feedback immediately. Don't just ignore it. Oh, it's minor. Let's not worry about it. The other thing that came up was top-down modeling, where leaders and supervisors should model the behavior. The other one is cultural immersions, where ethics should be part of the police station every day. Where if you're trying to change that culture, you have to have those discussions every day. The other thing is to make ethics part of the hiring criteria. So there's questions under which you hire. If you make assessments and engagement and things around ethics where you're only hiring people that score well when it comes to ethics, that's critical. And then the other thing that's novel is make polygraphs an annual every 2-year basis. Because you have police officers testifying in court. If I know I'm going to be polygraphed, then I'm less likely to be unethical or unprofessional, because that polygraph can determine, my status within the police force. And a final one that kind of came down at the end of the discussion that didn't make it into my research, but came down later on was, part of the reason why when it takes place in these communities, they never prosecute, because the same prosecutors that need to prosecute these police also need these police to testify in court in their cases. So one of the things that kind of came out is the ability to be able to switch these cases to either a federal judge, federal prosecutor, or be able to switch them to another jurisdiction state that's not aligned with that local police force. But this is a very simple project where I did I did a focus group with, 4 groups of officers. We did it on Zoom and I collected data and I turned this into an article. These are the types of projects you do as a public administration student. Next slide, Dr. Rahim. So as we get to the end, a couple of things I want you to think about. I think you should be thinking about where you want to go next. Like, obviously you chose a program, you had a rationale and reason behind that, but you've got to develop a way to multitask. You've got to pick your landing spot now while you're a student, because there may be certain things that you have to build and be self-directed and do while you're still in class. Now, some of you say, work in class, how can I do both at the same time? You really have to do it. I think because part of it is about being strategic about your career. One of the things I explain to people is a concept called role modeling. So if you know you want to be in a certain think tank or organization, LinkedIn is a beautiful thing. You can find people, but go to these think tanks, and when you scholars, their bios are there. Look at their bios, Google the things on their bios and see, is this something I can do? Or is this something I can learn about? Because realize a lot of these organizations are like private country clubs. They admit people that look like them. So what you want to do is have the same experiences they do, like them on paper. Think tank work. Identify think tanks. There are a lot of nonpartisan think tanks. There are some partisan, no matter where you work with them, but you can Google think tanks. A lot of interns where you could be remote, or you can work on small projects, or there are things where you can volunteer. Hey, I'm a graduate student. I'd like to volunteer on a various project with you. Maybe it's unpaid, but in return, I'd like for you to write a recommendation letter of endorsement for me. So there's creative ways that you think about that. Government careers. USA Jobs website would have government careers. You can search jobs by agencies, or you can search jobs by job types. Fellowship, Presidential Management Fellows. World Bank has some things, and there's an organization in DC, it's called Center of Peace Studies. I put Center or Peace Studies, but It's Center of, look at that. And then there's research careers, and then there's, academic careers. So for those of y'all that are thinking about the next step, there's a really cool program that would fit well with this is Old Dominion University in Virginia, which is a brick and mortar school, has a PhD that's remote in public administration and policy. The beauty about this program is it's only 49 credits. There are no residency requirements. And if you are a Virginia resident, it costs $26,000 for the whole. If you are a non-Virginia resident, it is $30,000 for the whole PhD. So for those of you all that might be thinking about the next step, that's a next step. Research one, brick and mortar school, not to overwhelm you. Next slide, and I think we're at the questions.
All right. Well, before we go to questions, I want to thank you, Dr. Darrell Burrell, for your time, for your knowledge, and we look forward to you answering questions. So let me just move over to stopping the recording here.